tonight's presentation, Scott Fisher did our awesome welcome, and then Joan gave an update of the History Center. Now, Dami and I are going to do our hometown history episode, which will take about 5 to 7 minutes. We're going to talk about Quakers in York County. Then we'll get into the bulk of tonight's presentation, which is Stories Under the Stacks. I have a wonderful crew of local historians who are going to come up and share their really neat stories of York County history. And then we'll finish with Jim McClure, Stump the Historian, although we did contemplate beforehand changing it to Stomp One Historian, but we were told no, that's probably a bad idea.
So we are Hometown History, Jamie and Dami's Yoko Backstory, and tonight the title of our little episode that we're going to have for you is York's Quakers Silently Worship in the Same Meeting House Since 1766. And tonight we're at the York County History Center, but if you would look back through the glass where Reddy is, you would be able to see that meeting house. So that's sort of setting the stage for you what we're going to talk about tonight. And I'm sure most of you didn't even realize that there was a Quaker meeting house right beside the York County History Center.
So a little bit about us. My name is Jamie Norpel. I used to be a local history teacher. Now I work downtown at a nonprofit that supports law enforcement called the York County Safety Collab and public safety. I have a local history blog called Wondering in York County, and Jim McClure and I have a website that we co-run called Witnessing York. I have a master's in American Studies and a PhD in American Studies from Penn State as well. And I live in Newberrytown with my husband and 1-year-old, and they're probably off running around in the gallery somewhere. He is a saint.
If you see a little blonde baby running around, that's Otto. I'm Dami Miller, and I also live in Newberrytown. Jamie and I live down the street from each other. I am a Third Circuit Court of Appeals librarian for the Middle District of Pennsylvania in Harrisburg. I'm a Civil War reenactor in my free time. I founded Preserving the History of Newberrytown, and I'm also in charge of the Lewisberry Area Lovers History Group, and I have a master's in library science.
Yeah, awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so let's dive in to talk about Quakers. So faith and freedom are rooted in the foundation of Pennsylvania. You all heard of William Penn and how he had his Quaker beliefs, and he brought them here, of course. So he proclaimed religious freedom here, and the ground we're even standing on tonight was ordained by William Penn, and the idea that we have religious freedom here. In fact, the Quakers were some of the first Europeans to settle York County, Pennsylvania, and most of them, though, chose land north of the Conewago Creek. We're thinking like Newberrytown, Lewisberry, Warrington area.
So the building that we're going to talk about tonight is the York Friends Meeting House, and that's the oldest continuously operating house of worship in York County. So that's a huge claim to fame. And the congregation dates back to before the Revolutionary War. So according to Prowl, and I'm sure many of you have read Prowl's History of York County, the York meeting was established in 1754 after obtaining permission from the Warrington Group. And the eastern portion of the structure was originally built all the way back in 1766, followed by the western addition that was added in 1783.
Here's a list of some of the original preachers, and what's really interesting and I want to point out is we had some female preachers, which is pretty exceptional. This was before women could vote, but you see names up there like Margaret and like Anne, and so I want to celebrate the Quakers. They've always had this idea of equality, and it dates back to their literally their foundation.
Yeah, so some of you might not be familiar with what it looks like to worship as a Quaker. So the worship sessions start when the first person is quietly seated in the meeting room. So unlike many Christian churches, there's no announcements and there's no preacher standing at the front of the room. You sit there in silent reflection and you reflect on your faith. So instead of listening to a message from a preacher, a Quaker is looking inward to the light of God. And that's present in each one of us. That's what they believe. And it reminds us of a group meditation. It's an early form of meditation, but, with Christian ties.
Yeah. So there may be moments in Quakerism where people feel moved that they received what's called a message, and they might have what we call local ministry. They might rise, they might share their message. It really comes from within, and they get a lot of autonomy to make that choice. After the worship is done, after about an hour, it finishes with a handshake, and then they celebrate with a luncheon afterwards in the room next door. A couple weeks ago, they graciously welcomed me into their meeting house, and we got to see their luncheon, and it was just a good feel. It was very comfortable. The food was delicious. So it was honestly just a really great feeling to be there.
They're really welcoming.
Yeah.
So you're probably wondering, where did the Quakers come from? Where did they originate? So Quakers came from England during the mid-1600s, and they were inspired by the Reformation. So groups were breaking away from the official church, and they were creating their own Christian sects. So George Fox was the founder, and he wanted to return to a simpler form of Christianity, and that diverged from the more complex forms that were being practiced. And then the hierarchical institution of the Church of England was something that he really wanted to get away from. So to no one's surprise, they were persecuted for their beliefs. And it wasn't until William Penn founded the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 1681 that the Quakers were able to practice their faith freely here in the New World.
So why did they come to then York County? We said that they were some of the first Europeans to settle this area. Well, this dates back to the Quakers were very heavily involved in government. So from the beginning, they were interested in things like land ownership, taxes, criminal justice system, construction, even voting and elections. So during the 1720s, there were more Germans who were moving into the Lancaster area. And the English were concerned of what this changing demographic was going to look like. So you all heard of John Wright, right? He was the ferryman, he was a merchant, and so he was told to move over to York County and keep an eye on those Germans, and so he was a Quaker, and that's really how the first Quakers came to York County.
Okay, but how did the Quakers get their name? So this is a little bit of a fun fact that some of you might not know. So the term originated when Fox, the founder, told a judge to quake before the authority of God, and the judge called Fox and the others Quakers. So originally it was used as a derogatory term, but the Quakers ended up adopting it and accepting it, and they sort of turned it into their own term, and they went with it. So now we call them Quakers, or Friends is what their preferred terminology is, but they're known as Quakers.
So it's kind of a really cool example of someone using terminology and language to discriminate and to hurt others, and then this group taking that word and flipping it on its head and saying, no, it's not your word anymore, it's now our word. So I thought that was a really cool example. So we wanted to give a shout out to a few Quakers in our history. The first one goes back to an apple tree. So about 200 years ago, there were a bunch of schoolboys who were digging around this apple tree on Mr. Johnson's farm, and this was currently at the time in the borough of York. And if you're thinking wintertime, most of the apples should have decayed on the ground. They shouldn't be viable anymore to eat. But as the boys were digging around this tree, they found some good apples that were still edible. So can you imagine, this was before we had grocery stores. So these boys were excited. They found this apple and it was still fresh. Here's a quick example. Yep. So it's kind of exceptional that this happened, that they were able to find this fresh fruit.
Yeah, so they were inspired to give it to Mr. Johnson to gift the specimen to Jonathan Jessup, and he was a nurseryman, and they wanted him to take the stems and graft a new form of an apple, a new hybrid. And it was first called Jonathan's Fine Winter, but it later changed to the York Imperial. So I don't know if any of you knew that we had our own apple here in York, one of our claims to fame. And it dominated the apple market in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, and even West Virginia, well into the 20th century. So today, Apple Hill Medical Center is named for the York Imperial apple. So think of that when you're driving by Apple Hill.
Also, the Friends planted their own apple tree, York Imperial, and so it's literally 100 yards from where we are right now. And so that is my son on our recent visit, him looking at the York Imperial.
He's an apple tree high.
Yeah. So the York County Quakers also played a crucial role in the Underground Railroad. Why? It's because they believed that human slavery was not merely wrong, but it was a violation of the moral and natural law that we have. However, they lived in a government where people were viewed as property. And so when you think about what mattered more to them, what mattered more, whether it was their government or their God. And what they decided was that when their religious beliefs conflicted with the law of the land, it was their Christian duty to suffer rather than obey. And so they were huge in the Underground Railroad.
And we really want to highlight a few Quakers tonight. So two of them that we'd like to mention are Susanna Wright and her husband Jonathan Mifflin of the famed Mifflin House. I'm sure some of you have heard of that. They were some of the earliest Underground Railroad conductors in eastern New York County. They sheltered unknown numbers of freedom seekers, and they provided them with food and safety when they were crossing the river. The former home is the focal point for the Susquehanna Discovery Center that's underway in Helm Township.
That's gonna be super cool.
It is.
I'm really
very
excited
excited about it
yeah,
too.
Great view.
Oh yeah, one of the
Walking
people
past.
that works there is in the back. He's super excited.
Pete Maley is here. He has been hired by the Susquehanna Heritage Center to build it. So thank you, Pete, for coming out.
Talk to him after the presentation. I'm sure he can't wait to gush about it. He's very excited.
Here's some other York County Quakers that we just want to briefly mention. We've got Joseph Garrettson of Newberry Township. We also have the pioneering locomotive maker Phineas Davis, as well as the steamboat pioneer John Elger. And I would also be remiss if we didn't mention Lamar Matthew. He was the one who gave me this amazing tour a couple weeks ago, and just has so many great stories. And he's done a lot of research on Quakers and the Underground Railroad. So thank you to them for being so gracious. We're just so thankful that I had this misconception that when you think about Quakers, I think about the oatmeal box of like
Quaker
William
Oats.
Penn, Quaker
Yeah.
Oats, and
Powdered wigs and black
even,
clothing.
like walking past the old meeting house, it was like, oh yeah, that's that thing that happened 200 years ago. And then it wasn't until that I walked into the Quaker meeting house that I'm like, oh no, like you guys are still alive, and there are still Quakers that are here and that are practicing.
They're amongst us.
And then Lamar showed me a bench that they use when people get married, and people sign this bench. And I knew some of the people. I'm like, I didn't know they were the Quaker. I didn't know they were a Quaker.
I know someone on stage that got married with a Quaker license.
That's right. I got married with a Quaker wedding. I forgot about that. Yeah.
You forgot already?
Sorry. My husband's not even here, so he's out running after my kids. That's fine.
So now that's our takeaways. We always wrap up with takeaways. So Quakers were among pioneering Pennsylvanians, and their beliefs helped shape the early development of America and the New World. But the Quaker faith is still very much held today, like we just talked about, and there are about 400,000 Quakers worldwide in 87 different countries.
The other Quaker, also here is their website. They are active on Facebook and Instagram, so I encourage you to research more. The other takeaway is that here's a picture of their cemetery, and then you can see the glass of the new History Center in the background. And we think that this is an amazing partnership. They have their neighbors now, so they will be telling stories of our heritage for generations to come. So we're very thankful that they've been good neighbors to one another. And also, if you look right out the window, this right here is a porta potty. And they kept it. It's one of the oldest outhouses, right? And there's been some research on the history of it. So I just thought you should know that that's what that fun building is next time you do a tour around the History Center.
We always end up talking about outhouses at some point during history presentation. It's just one of those things people like to hear about.
All right, so Dami and I are finished with our quick hometown history.